Hey there, welcome to YouTube. If you are into poetry, if you are into literature, if you are into cultural history, then you've come to the right place. Cardboard Box Productions makes podcasts about all those things, so be sure to click the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so that you never miss a new episode. Obviously, we mostly make podcasts, so you can also go to anywhere you get your podcasts, if it's a place other than YouTube, like Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and you can subscribe to our podcast feeds there. All right, I hope you enjoy this episode. Hello and welcome to Close Talking, the world's most popular poetry analysis podcast from Cardboard Box Productions Incorporated. I am co-host Jack Rossiter Munley, and with my good friend Connor McNamara Stratton, we read a poem,
talk about the poem,
and read the poem again.
Before we get into today's selection, a quick note that if you like what we do here at Close Talking and have a spare minute of your time, it would mean the world to us if you would give the podcast a rating and review on Apple Podcasts.
Those ratings and reviews help boost us up the algorithm and find new listeners.
And if you have suggestions for future episodes or comments on this one, you can send us an email at closetalkingpoetry@gmail.com.
And you can also find us on social media. On Twitter, the show is @CloseTalking. I am @Jack Rossiter Munn, and Connor is @Connor M. Stratton. On Instagram, the show is @CloseTalkingPoetry, and on Facebook, it's facebook.com/CloseTalking. We also have a website, closetalking.com, where you can find all the past episodes of the show, and Cardboard Box Productions has just launched a newsletter, Unboxed, and if you go to cardboardboxproductionsinc.com, you can subscribe for more behind-the-scenes stuff on Close Talking and all of the other literary and cultural history podcasts that Cardboard Box Productions makes. On with the show.
Welcome to another episode of your favorite poetry podcast, Close Talking. I am one of your co-hosts, Connor McNamara Stratton.
And I am your other co-host, Jack Rossiter Munley.
And we have got a wild, rancid poem for you today. Maybe not rancid, but it is verging on the grotesque. But it's great. And it is by the poet I, who spelled A-I, who's one of our great poets, was born in 1947, died in 2010. Her selected poems, Vice, won the National Book Award in 1999. And she's known for her sort of, quote, bleak, dramatic monologues, is how the Poetry Foundation described her. And really, throughout her whole career, basically almost exclusively used the form of the first person persona poem. And this poem today is no exception. It's called I Have Got to Stop Loving You, So I Have Killed My Black Goat. I think I will read it.
Yeah, let's hear it. The title itself is super intense, and it really does set you up nicely for how distressing the poem is. Because, I mean, my black goat just makes it so perverse that it was killed, because it really creates that connection between the writer and the goat that is,
I know.
It's my black goat, and I've destroyed its life now. Yeah, let's hear it.
Let's hear it. I have got to stop loving you, so I have killed my black goat. His kidney floats in a bowl, a beige flat fish, around whom parasites, slices of lemon, break through the surface of hot broth, then sink below, as I bend, face down in the steam, breathing in. I hear this will cure anything. When I am finished, I walk up to him. He hangs from a short wooden post, tongue stuck out of his mouth, tasting the hay-flavored air. A bib of flies gathers at his throat, and further down, where he is open and bare of all his organs, I put my hand in, stroke him once, then taking it out, look at the sky. The storm clouds there break open, and raindrops yellow as black cat's eyes, come down, each a tiny river, hateful and alone. Wishing I could get out of this alive, I hug myself. It is hard to remember if he suffered much. So there you go.
Yikes.
I hope you're not listening to this over a fine meal.
Or just in general, I hope you're not squeamish.
Yeah. And she really is known for like just very kind of a poetry of abjection, very brutal topics. And the titles of her books, I'll just read them out because I think they sort of indicate the continuity. This poem was first published in her first book called Cruelty in 1973. And then it was republished in her new and selected Vice. She also published Killing Floor, Sin, Fate, Greed, Dread, and her last book was called No Surrender. But this is another one I like to teach because, you know, we talk sometimes about the use of concrete detail and why that's important to get you in the poem. And the great thing about that mantra is it can be taken to an extreme, perhaps a logical extreme, which I think this poem illustrates well, where the detail is grotesque. It begins with a kidney floating in a bowl that's compared to a beige fish, and there's parasites, and basically the plot of the poem is the speaker doesn't want to love this person, is in pain about it or something, has sort of sacrificed her goat and made a kind of, seems like, cauldron broth with the organs, or at least the kidney. That's sort of like a ritual maybe to cleanse herself of this love or this pain, and then walks up to the goat that's hanging on a post and sticks her hand inside of the goat and then takes it out and looks up at the sky where there's like yellow acid rain almost, and then hugs herself. And that's basically sort of what happens. But I have a lot of thoughts. I'm curious. I sort of was like, hey, Jack, want to read this poem? Want to talk about it? And I kind of threw it at you. So I apologize for that. I'm not sure you knew what was coming.
No, I was not. I don't know that anyone could be fully prepared for this poem before actually digging into it. And it is a poem that I have found more than most that I come across that particularly rewards rereading and continued engagement. Because at first, the literally visceral aspects of the poem can be a bit overwhelming, which I think is entirely intentional, and indeed is its own kind of fulfilling experience, because it's rare that you're moved that strongly by something you read one way or another, even if it is towards retching. Which, to be clear, I didn't. I have an iron stomach when it comes to my literary diet, so don't even worry about it, friends. It starts off so strong with a kidney floating in this sort of rancid broth. It conjured for me a lot of images of sort of like a backwoods witch's cabin. I don't know, some kind of like forest witch, basically. But it really is a poem of such incredible sadness and loss. And particularly at the end, where you find this figure who throughout the poem has been yearning and wanting and everything, but ends up kind of in the fetal position, crouched over and hugging herself. And I found that image particularly stuck with me because it really is holding yourself together. And we've just spent the whole poem ruminating on this split open goat. And it's like she's holding herself together in the same way that the goat was split open. And it was, those contrasts really stuck with me. Because even in the reflection on her own loss and what she's doing, hugging herself, it calls back to the goat. And then the end of the poem calls back to it saying, it's hard to remember if he suffered much.
Yeah.
So she's thinking.
Yeah.
So she's thinking the connection is not lost on the speaker in the poem.
Yeah. No, that's great reading. Yeah, and I love this poem because it illustrates something that happens, I think, in a lot of poems, but in a forceful, sort of direct way, and it's the sort of most prominent feature in some way, which is this kind of, I don't have a great way of talking about it. It's this kind of idea of proxy, or like a proxy image. So it's very notable that the you in this poem, or the one that the speaker is trying to get over, is mentioned in the title and then literally not at all. And there's basically, you have no idea who they are, what happened between them, what their history is, just that the speaker is tormented by her love of this person. And yet, this focus on the goat does this kind of proxy work for what the relationship and the love means for the speaker, which is very interesting and compelling. And so the goat basically has this kind of dual function where, on the one hand, it's sort of the plot of the ritual to cleanse the speaker, perhaps, but it also is sort of a stand-in or a literalization of the suffering that the speaker herself feels, I think.
It's a literal scapegoat.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure the origins of scapegoat is that in the Bible, when the Jews are wandering in the wilderness, I think they put the leader puts all the sins into a goat and then releases it to release the sins of the people, if I'm remembering that correctly. And so this similarly lays a lot of the pain and loss of the relationship into the body of the goat, and then splits it open and transforms it into the healing broth.
Yeah. Oh, that is fascinating. I had not made that connection. Yeah. And just, I feel like this is a common thing, not just in poetry, but in sort of art in a lot of forms, where, like, even in movies,
it could sort of be like Rosebud in Citizen Kane, where Rosebud is this key that unlocks who Kane was, and it's his dying word, but it sort of stands in for everything he never had as a child and all that he was compensating for in the rest of his life.
This will not be recorded, but I have not.
I've never seen Citizen Kane.
I know, it's very bad.
It's actually no, the movie's very good, actually. It's okay.
One of the best I've heard. One of the best. Ooh. Here are other examples. The end of the movie The Danish Girl, which came out recently, which follows a transgender woman, like the first transition in some kind of ways, but ends with they're remembering her at the end of the movie in some capacity, and they fly this kite. And the last scene, you're looking at this kite. And I feel like it's sort of a proxy metaphor for this sort of liberation that the Danish girl character sort of achieved. And so they can't sort of express that perhaps in words, but you are meant to read into the image of the beautiful kite.
Because that really is a lot of what's going on here. The reality of the relationship cannot be adequately touched upon, and so it's transplanted into this related goat corpse.
Yes. I guess I'm thinking maybe we should get specific at some point, but I'm thinking in big general ideas these days, by which I mean today. So one thing that we've talked about is concrete details. And so there's a sort of cliche that to get to the universal, you have to go through the particular. And that's kind of like thing that, we see a lot in all sort of art, basically. But there's another contrast that I think has sort of a parallel, which is this sort of tension between the sacred and the profane, which is sort of a distinction that goes back probably forever. But specifically, I know about it was very present in the English Renaissance with during Shakespeare's time, and Marlowe and John Donne and George Herbert and other people, where they're talking about very sacred topics, God, Christ, religion, whatever, but they're getting at it through profane imagery. And I feel like there's a parallel between the profane and the particular, or the specific or the concrete, and the universal and the sacred, or the transcendent. And in some ways, I feel like the profane is merely the logical extreme of the specific. And anyway, there's just interesting things that sort of other references that just help me contextualize how this goat is working, because it's a very grotesque, very profane, but it is the means through which you have to pass through this mutilated goat to get to the sense of this profound suffering, perhaps sacred suffering, that the speaker is feeling. And this makes me think of, there's this great scholarly work that I read some of in college that's called Closet Devotions by Richard Rambis, which was kind of about English Renaissance art. But basically, it was a rewriting of a lot of scholarship that had taken all of these renderings of Christ as sort of making Christ effeminate. And I mean, this is reductive, but saying that there actually were like sort of homoerotic representations, and that there was actually a lot of. But one focus on was this poet Richard Crashaw, who was very striking in that he was like obsessed with the orifices of Christ and the wounds of Christ in this kind of way that was like both was quite grotesque, but also was sort of a way at getting at this profound love for Christ and Christianity by extension, or whatever. So here's a part of one of Crashaw's poems, which is translated as the title, "On the Wounds of the Lord Hanging on the Cross." Whether I call your wounds eyes or mouths, surely everywhere are mouths. Alas, everywhere are eyes. Behold the mouths, oh, blooming with lips too red. Behold the eyes, ah, wet with cruel tears. Picturing the wounds of Christ as he's on the cross bleeding, and picturing those wounds as like mouths or eyes to be done with what one might, is sort of an example of that. And Rambis makes a connection between this kind of poetry in the English Renaissance and other more contemporary work. The big example that I can think of is Christ, which is this photograph by Andres Serrano, which is kind of this image of Jesus on the cross, but like basically being showered in urine.
Submerged in urine, isn't it? Isn't it a crucifix in urine and then he took a picture?
Yep, you're absolutely right. Sorry. So yeah, and it's the artist's own urine.
Well, I mean, if you're going to do it.
If you're going to do it, I mean, you might as well do it yourself. But it's a similar kind of thing where it's a very extreme example of this profane, but in some ways concrete depiction or way of getting at something sacred or profound.
I really like that connection, because that brings up the exact challenge that this poem presents. And like the challenge for a lot of people with, for example, Piss Christ, is like, how do I get past the vulgarity of this work, which is an important component of it and is really a huge part of what's going on in the work? How do I access the message that it's trying to give me? And when I read this poem, partially because of a YouTube rabbit hole I went down, the play Titus Andronicus, which is Shakespeare's like most bloody and extreme play, which, for him is saying quite a lot. But Julie Taymor did one of the most famous productions of it. She made a movie of it in the late 90s. And one of her comments on it was, "I love the truth of the play, but I hate the reality of the play." And I think that's such a great way of thinking about these kinds of works that mobilize the grotesque or mobilize shock value or the really jarring juxtaposition of the sacred and the profane to get to a core truth or to say something of real power and emphasis. One of the actors was also commenting a little bit crudely on, Hollywood makes movies where thousands of people die in them and hundreds of people get blown up and everything, but we make one movie where like these kinds of really horrible acts hit home and are examined, and it's done really artfully and it's done with a purpose, and no studio is going to back that because they get freaked out about it. Like he bakes people into food or whatever, like it's changed a little bit since the late 90s because they do this now in more stuff. But like these really out there depictions of what can be done to a body, or what can be done here to the body of a goat, like that, there's a challenge in the reality of it, but there's so much value in the truth that it can reveal that it sort of makes it worthwhile. And I think a lot of the litmus test, at least for me, when I'm engaging with this kind of work, which I do a fair amount, I like Cormac McCarthy, I like Flannery O'Connor, lots of people who do lots of grotesque stuff in their books. But the test is sort of what are you pointing me towards at the end? Did I just deal with all this for nothing, or was there some core truth in it that you were pointing me towards? My measuring point for that is always the movie Lone Survivor, which when I finished, I just felt like I'd watched a whole bunch of people get shot to hell for like 2 hours, and I had no idea what I was supposed to take away from that. It really was just an exercise in like pain and abuse to the human body. And I think that where this poem really soars is that it does constantly point you back to the message it wants you to take. And I think it does that through this addition of, it's not just about the killing of the goat, it's about the use that the goat's killing was put to. And it's always bringing you back to that over and over and over again in the text of the poem. And that's where I was able to get through the reality of the poem and into the truth of it, which was where I was able to hold on to what I really liked about it, even in the face of like a bib of flies gathered at his throat, or stroking the inside of it. Because even in the stroking of the inside, it then goes to her looking at the sky. And I can imagine the scene of her having just stroked the inside of this bloody goat, holding her red hand up to this, yellow rain that's coming down in the middle of this dark forest. Like, it conjured a really meaningful image that was this heightened sense of cosmic grief that she's feeling. And the stroking of the goat, other imagery about that aside, just the image of a red hand raised to like a yellow sky, I found really powerful and spoke to me of like this small person in the face of torrential universal grief or whatever. It really, it added to my experience of the poem.
Yeah, no, that makes me think. So just some other quick examples. The word stroke is like, that's such a great, terrible word to read. But really, yeah, gets at the sensuality and the gentleness and the sexuality of that word stroke in this context is like very important, I think. But yeah, in terms of other like moments, like in movies often, that's so interesting about the Titus Andronicus, because also the most horrifying parts of movies are the small violences. Like in 3 Billboards, it's the thing in the fingernail. What is it? The drill, the dentist drill that goes in the thumbnail. And that is brutal. And like, there's like times when like the barber is like about to, the first cut into a neck is always like the most excruciating. Whereas you can watch, like you said, just like people being mowed down forever and not feel that much.
The famous Stalin quote, "One death is a tragedy, a million deaths is a statistic." I mean, it's like a little microcosm of that, right?
Yeah, that does make me think, and I love that you brought up those, like the yellow rain, because there's also that's also so sad, where I feel like the way I read that moment, the storm clouds there break open and raindrops, yellow as black cat's eyes come down, each a tiny river, hateful and alone. There's kind of this moment where she's sort of done the thing. She's killed the goat, she's smelled the steam and stroked the inside or whatever. Like the ritual that was supposed to cleanse her has been done. And will it work? And so she kind of looks to the sky, and it's yellow rain that are like black cat's eyes, which is like a classic cursed animal or a symbol of being cursed, and the little hateful and alone rivers. And so there's this even with this like really extreme act, it's futile ultimately. It feels like it. And she says right after, wishing I could get out of this alive, I hugged myself. That she had thought maybe this would help her get out of loving this person and the pain of that, and it doesn't.
I think the hateful and alone is clearly meant to refer to the raindrops, but it can also refer to the speaker as well, which I really like the way that it's broken off by that comic. It kind of goes both ways a little bit, and that I thought was just really excellent poem craft.
Yeah, no, I agree. And that's also like another, even without the syntactical part, which I think is totally right, that leads you there. Like the environment is so often used as a reflection of interiority. And so, you know, there's always like, it was a dark and stormy night or blah, blah, blah. But that's like the sort of classic. But this is kind of a version of the dark and stormy night where she looks out and the external world reflects both the hatred and the solitude and aloneness that she feels.
And then it ends reflecting back both on the goat and then, because of what the goat stands for, the person that she is, I guess, no longer with, or at least who she wants to stop loving. It's hard to remember if he suffered much. And I literally wrote, I sure hope not, but it doesn't sound promising. Thinking about this poor goat, because I don't know what the mechanism of ritual slaughter was, but also it sort of reflects back to the nature of whatever the relationship might have been. And it's sort of sad because it's almost like she's thinking, I don't know if he was sad about this at all.
Yeah, I think you're right that the he sort of works both as the goat and the other person, the you in the relationship. Because if it's the you, it's like, did they even care? And like, I'm just the only one who cares. And that's just like one of the worst feelings. But then it's also like, you didn't even know, you just like slaughtered this animal and you can't even remember if it felt any pain, which is a kind of, it's like a sort of, maybe that's how the you effectively, you know, figuratively slaughtered the speaker and can't even remember if like she felt two ways about it, which is just brutal. Another pop culture example. I just saw Call Me by Your Name, which is
nice.
So
I have not seen that yet, but it's supposed to be amazing.
You have to see it. So good. I won't spoil it, but it's a coming of age story between this 17-year-old boy and this young man. But there's this one scene that's very powerful where like the boy is like sort of fantasizing about the guy and has this peach and like puts his thumb in like really deep into the peach, and then the juice of the peach is like, he's like lying in bed, is like dripping all over his body, and then he masturbates with the peach and then sets the peach and finishes inside of it, and then the guy comes in and like he's about to basically go down on him and taste he's like, what happened? And then he sees the peach, and then he like starts to eat the peach, and the boy, like knowing what's there, and the boy just starts like sobbing, and it's like this really incredible scene. But it's a perfect illustration of there's like this profound lust and love, but also this profound sense of shame or uncertainty about it that is sort of like put in this profane, concrete peach that sort of serves as a proxy for their relationship and their feeling about their relationship.
I think that's maybe the best example that we've come up with yet, because much like the goat, the peach first had to be split in some way to make room for all of the meaning that it will be imbued with. And I think that's a really important component of what's going on with the goat, because as closed off as she is at the end, without that goat being ripped open, the space for all of this to take place would not exist. And it's sort of the same with the peach. It has to be punctured first before any meaning can be put into it.
Yeah, no, that's so true. Also, and this is sort of similar, but the movie is just so good. But one of the ways that scene is so good is the shot is so long of him like puncturing the peach before you know like what he's going to do with it. So you just sort of are looking at him like putting his thumb in the peach and the juice dripping before everything else happens. And that reminds me of the way sort of I've talked about like duration of images and how you have to hold an image for sometimes, longer for it to have the effect. And in this poem, the goat's mutilation has to be described at length for it to serve as a figurative representation. In the same way that I feel like the longer that the peach was sort of just a peach in the scene, that you're just looking at the peach, makes what comes after and the sort of metaphor that serves like all that more potent.
On the subject of the profane, I guess quickly, I know we touched on like what having my black goat in the title does, but I think it's also kind of profane because my has that sense of ownership or responsibility, and this is not how you treat those that you are responsible for or over whom you have some sort of control. And so I think the profanity of the act that you get hit with, his kidney floats in a bowl at the beginning, is really set up by having that in the title, which is the inclusion of just my instead of a, or, not even mentioning the goat and just saying, I've got to stop loving you, is really part of what launches this poem so effectively.
There's also this article that I found. This is sort of the last thought that I have. It's called, the piece is in the, I think, American Poetry Review, and it's called Earn the Vomit, Employing the Grotesque in Contemporary Poetry. It's by Anna Journey, who's a phenomenal poet. Her first book is called Vulgar Remedies. She talks about this poem, and I just think the way that Journey talks about it was helpful for me to think about. So the ritually slaughtered black goat is an open structure, a locus of ambivalence that allows for tenderness and violence, love and hate, repulsion and attraction. We discover that the witchy speaker has killed her own goat in order to use its internal organs as the ingredients of a spell or charm against heartache. And this is exactly what Jack was saying. The adjective my in the title disrupts our conventional attitudes about how one goes about treating a pet, making the sacrificial killing a transgressive act. The black goat becomes a surrogate for the act of murdering the speaker's lover, as well as a reflection of her own violent emotion. The flayed corpse is a hybrid form, a plurality of animal and human bodies. Anyway, I like all this. The other thing too, and here's the other part, is using these sort of proxy images or metaphors to stand in for something, as Journey notes, allows for a lot more complexity, because you're not just saying, I loved you, I'm sad, I am violently sad, in which case you get the idea, A, it's uninteresting, but also the meaning is clear. Whereas here, this body is hybrid, it's dual, it's ambivalent, it's both, the speaker's both attracted to it, but it's also repulsive. And so there's a lot more ways that you can read one image, because the image is just being itself. It's not telling you how to read it.
That's an excellent point. Because I think when these kinds of images fail is when you're being so clearly pointed towards, this means this. Look at how it means it. Hey, did you notice that this is what it means? Like, that's where it becomes like, all right, okay, I get it. Yes, fine. The sword stands in for his manliness. I understand. It's like, oh, his sword was cut in half when he lost his job. Like, okay, I get it. Like when it's hammered home, as with many storytelling devices or images and things. But when it's just presented to you as that way without it being told over and over and over again, it becomes incredibly effective.
This actually sort of reminds me of this thing that my friend Hannah, who's also a poet, sent me, which is very weird, but it's sort of this conversation that Charles Simic, who's another great poet, might have been having with himself under weird egos, but it's called Narrative of the Image, a Correspondence. But anyway, in that, there's a distinction made between the image and the metaphor, which I think I often conflate and probably did in this podcast. And this is an example of the image working, where the image does not tell you something, it just is. Whereas the metaphor maybe uses an image, but it aspires to tell you something. So one way that they described this distinction was It's true the image is less and the metaphor is more. As the master said, for knowledge add, for wisdom take away. The image is Zen, metaphor is Christian.
That's cool.
Which is kind of cool.
It's sort of like, I'm thinking of Star Wars. But like the very opening of the first Star Wars, you get this image of a ship, and then you see it being chased by this infinitely long, what we come to learn is an Imperial Star Destroyer. And in those two images, you so clearly get the picture of what's going on. It's this image of a small ship being chased and this enormous, all-encompassing, oppressive force coming after it. And that is the rebellion in the Empire. True. And because it is not the like spelled out metaphors of the prequels, it's just this visual storytelling, really. That's anyway,
yeah,
we've come up with many more examples than necessary. Hopefully some of these find their way to the cutting room floor, but I don't know that I have anything else. So
I think I'm spent. I mean, it is funny. We've spent all this time talking about how the image is, well, if the image is less, we've just been like adding on to the ways to read it in a sort of excessive way. But that could be fun in its own way. So take anything, take nothing, take all of it. But let's hear it again.
Yeah, let's hear it again.
I have got to stop loving you, so I have killed my black goat. His kidney floats in a bowl, a beige flat fish, around whom parasites, slices of lemon, break through the surface of hot broth, then sink below. As I bend, face down in the steam, breathing in. I hear this will cure anything. When I am finished, I walk up to him. He hangs from a short wooden post, tongue stuck out of his mouth, tasting the hay-flavored air. A bib of flies gathers at his throat, and further down, where he is open and bare of all his organs, I put my hand in, stroke him once, then taking it out, look at the sky. The storm clouds there break open, and raindrops, yellow as black cat's eyes, come down, each a tiny river, hateful and alone. Wishing I could get out of this alive, I hug myself. It is hard to remember if he suffered much.
This is co-host Jack Rossiter Munley. Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, head on over to Apple Podcasts, leave a review. 5 stars maybe? Those reviews help with the algorithm and are a great way for us to find new listeners. And you can put anything in them. You can write whatever you want. You can just say, oh, this is a good podcast. I like this podcast. You could be like, hey, that Connor guy, he makes a lot of good points. Jack, why is he doing this outro so long? You know, get him off the mic. And whatever you feel like writing, head on over there, 5 stars, drop in the review. Do you have thoughts about this poem? Is there a poem or poet you'd like us to cover on a future episode? Well, we'd love to hear from you. And there are tons of ways that you can get in touch with us. I mean, I guess you could drop it into an iTunes review. You could be like 5 stars. Hey, why don't you talk about insert name of poet here? But you can also send us an email. That's probably the best way to do it. closetalkingpoetry@gmail.com is our email address. Or you can find us on Twitter. I am at Jack Rossiter Munn. Connor is at Connor M. Stratton. And the show is at Close Talking. On Instagram, you can find us there too. We are at Close Talking Poetry. And we are on Facebook at facebook.com/Close Talking. We haven't gotten to TikTok yet, and we might never. Who knows? Anything's possible. Speaking of all those social media platforms, a very special thank you to our incredible social media manager, Corey Chena, who keeps us active across the internet. And a thank you to all of you for listening. We will see you next time.